record. Okay. So, all right, here we are, Civil War exam review, and let's just jump right into it and rock and roll. Making good choices online, you know about that. Thank you for continuing to make good choices. Again, just as a reminder, class, the code and password is for team only. Be dressed for school, school-appropriate virtual backgrounds. Keep your mic muted unless called upon. Keep the chat collect. Be kind. Like you know all of that. So thank you for continuing to make those good choices. In the announcements box right here, our final essential question, big idea. What do you need to know for the Civil War unit exam? We're going to be talking about that today. That is why you are here. It is on Monday, June 1st. It is at 10:30. Mr. Hahn and I, just like the Manifest Destiny unit exam, Mr. Hahn and I are going to be just here on Zoom, living, existing, hanging out, and here to answer any of your questions if you want to jump into the Zoom on Monday. But just so you know, you don't have to jump into the Zoom on Monday if you don't want to. That is totally, that's up to you, and you can decide whether or not you want to jump in to the Zoom on Monday. But I will post the exam at 10:30 a.m. on Monday, so just be prepared for that. Like I said, we will have our final YouTube live on Sunday evening, May 31st at 8 p.m. So that's going to be the night before the exam, so just be prepared for that. And then end of the year celebration, that's going to be on Wednesday. I don't know what that looks like, and that, you know, could just look like, you know, you hanging out. I don't know what's going on. I'm curious what's going on in math and science and English. Like what is happening in this final week? First of all, what's going on in science? What are you doing with Ms. Rob this last week? You know, coming up. Yeah. What are you doing, Emily?
Oh, so she gave us like an extra credit quiz, but other than that, it's kind of it.
Okay. Alexa, were you going to say that same thing?
My English teacher isn't giving any more assignments like at all.
Okay.
So like we don't have anything to do for English.
Okay. And you're talking about Miss N?
Yes, Miss N.
Okay. And then what about for math, Miss Grambois or Miss Joyce or Rippy? Which one's on our team? They're both twins. Joyce, right? Yeah, Miss Joyce. What are we doing in math? Emily says Ms. Grambois not giving any work. And Damien says same thing. Okay. So it sounds like, well, so the good news for everybody is it sounds like you can focus all of your mental energies on on history, which is awesome, or most of your mental energies. I wanted to just say that you can on Wednesday. I don't know what it's going to look like. We could play games. I have Jackbox games. If you ever played Jackbox, that's a lot of fun. We could just hang out. It's up to you. But next Wednesday will be a celebration, and for many of you, next Wednesday might be your final opportunity to hang out with the students from Team Amazon. So I definitely want to give you that opportunity if you'd like to take advantage of it next Wednesday. Alexa, what's good?
Oh, wait, am I unmuted? Oh yeah. Okay.
Yep, I hear you.
All right. So, so for the thing, I heard of a bunch of people playing Cahoots on Zoom. I've heard of a bunch of people like screen sharing and playing Cahoots, and the kids were like using other devices.
And we could do that too. Yeah, it's we can kind of figure it out. So if you have any ideas you want to share, then share them. Alex Ripa's asking, what is Jackbox? Jackbox is it's a computer game platform. It's like trivia games and drawing games. It's like party games, but games that you can play online. I've played them with my Rio TV students on our podcast. I played them with my family. They're a ton of fun. So anyway, we can figure that out when we get to. For those of you who are going to show up on Wednesday, we can figure that out. Yeah, Alexa?
I think you should make a Google form where everybody can write their ideas for Wednesday.
I would say let's make it even easier. If you have an idea, just throw it in the chat. Because I would say if you're listening right now, if you're in this class right now, go ahead and you can throw your idea in the chat. All right. There will be the video of this class posted here later today. And so you can go ahead and check that out. That'll be right here. You'll also, for those of you who are subscribed to my YouTube channel, you'll see it posted. If you have the notifications, you'll see it the moment it is posted, because that'll be up in just a little bit after we're done with our class. Okay, so we're going to talk about the Civil War. We're going to review those questions. So this is a good time right now. If you have the ability, if you've printed the study guide, then you can have it on paper next to you, or if you have two devices, then you can kind of go back and forth. But we're going to be going over the questions on the study guide. If you only have one device and that's what you're watching us on right now, then you could even maybe toggle so that you are listening to me and Mr. Hahn while you're answering the questions, kind of toggle back and forth, whatever is going to work best for you. But we're ready to go ahead and go over the answers to all of the review questions. So let's go ahead and jump into question number 1. What were the most significant reform movements of the 19th century? So let's talk a little bit about these. There were, I believe in my mind, there were 5 different reform movements, right, that were so important in the 19th century. The first is the temperance movement. So there were those, and keep in mind, we're going to talk about this a little bit more later. The people behind all of these reform movements, for the most part, were Christians. More specifically, they were Protestants. And it was these Protestant churches that were very focused on wanting to make life better, make people better, make them better Christians. And one of the ways that we can make people better Christians is by making these reforms, like making the country and the world a better place. So one of the things that they believed was that the consumption of alcohol was a sin, or rather that the consumption of alcohol led to sinful behavior, right? So if you take a look at this cartoon, for example, this is what's called the drunkard's progress. So it says step 1, a glass with a friend. In other words, you just start off, you just have a little bit of alcohol, not a big deal, you're hanging out. But then step 2, a glass to keep the cold out, right? So people who drink alcohol to stay warm. Step 3, a glass too much. Step 4, drunk and riotous. So, for some people, alcohol makes them violent. And then step 5, the summit attained, jolly companions, a confirmed drunkard, right? So they're all hanging out and partying there, and then you can see them kind of on the decline. After that, step 6, poverty and disease. Step 7, forsaken by friends, which means you're abusing alcohol so much that your friends don't want to hang out with you anymore. Step 8, desperation and crime. Step 9, death by suicide. And so this is, the very tragic story of someone. And then in the middle there, underneath kind of that bridge, you see this child and mother, the wife of the person who abuses alcohol. And that was really their argument, was that alcohol breaks up families. It leads to, you can see this list right here, it leads to spousal abuse, child abuse, the loss of your job, moral depravity, crime, and death. So their solution was, let's get rid of alcohol altogether. Did they achieve their goal? Well, they didn't achieve it in the 1800s, but they did finally achieve it with the 18th Amendment in 1919. So if you're going to learn this later on in 11th grade history, you'll learn about what's called the Prohibition era of American history. From 1919 to 1933, alcohol was illegal in our country. Now, were people still drinking? Yes. Were people producing illegal alcohol? Absolutely. It led to a sharp increase in crime, alcohol-related crime, and it didn't work, and it was repealed 14 years later. But for a short time in our country, the temperance movement actually did achieve its goal of making alcohol illegal in the United States. So, Kira says, make something illegal and everyone wants to do it. It is interesting, though, that during the time period that alcohol was illegal, 1919 to 1933, there was a decrease in alcohol abuse, alcohol-related deaths. Fewer people were drinking because it was illegal. There were some people, of course, who were still breaking the law and who were, they still wanted their liquor. But it did lead to a decrease in alcohol-related problems, alcohol-related death. It led to an increase in alcohol-related crime. So that was the temperance movement. I'll keep going. The next is the public education movement. Horace Mann, I think he might have been one of your vocab terms. Did I make Horace Mann a vocab term? I think so. Yes, thank you. Thank you, Chloe and John. So he's the one who began the movement to give all children a free public education. The idea is that we have better, more informed citizens. America is better if we have public education, if we offer everyone an education, because before this, only the rich, only the wealthy, the elite got educated, and it was usually only boys, not girls. I see hands up, Adrian, and then Alexa.
So, I saw a Drunk History episode recently where it was saying that like they put ethanol, or people were drinking ethanol, so they put poison in ethanol, so that when people drank ethanol to get drunk, they died.
I believe that may be true. I wouldn't believe everything that I see on Drunk History, but Drunk History is hilarious. I'm not endorsing it for I think it's sometimes a little PG-13, sometimes a little bit over that, but that could possibly be true. I'm not sure, but I would believe that. Thanks, Adrian. Alexa.
Can you repeat what the movement was called? The one after the temperance?
Oh, this next one is the public education movement. So this is the movement to offer free public education to every child in the United States. Now, the movement was mostly in the North.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, sure thing. Because in the South, they believed that education in the wrong hands was a dangerous thing. So if you remember from the crash course, John Green said it was dangerous to give education to poor whites because they need to know their station in life. They need to know that they're like, you can't aspire to something better than being poor your whole life. Stay in your own lane, right? Know your role. And then of course they also did not want African Americans. They didn't want slaves to be educated either. So the public education movement was really in the North, not really so much in the South. Okay, next is the abolitionist movement. We're going to talk about abolition later, so I'm not going to spend too much time on this. Basically, it was the movement to abolish slavery in the country. And then the women's rights movement, which we're going to talk about more. We talk about the Seneca Falls Convention. But again, the women's rights movement was this idea that, hey, you know what, maybe we should treat everybody equal, regardless of whether you're a man or a woman. So anyway, that's the women's rights movement. And I would argue that the movement for women's equality, it began in the 1800s. It still continues to this day. So, but you'll learn more. You'll see more of that on the Seneca Falls Convention slide. And then finally, Dorothea Dix. I believe Dorothea Dix is also another one of your vocab terms. And Dorothea Dix was fighting for reform for mental health and for people who were imprisoned. So back then, people with mental illness were basically treated like criminals, and they were locked up in what are called insane asylums. We would never refer to an institution today as an insane asylum. It's a very horrible and cruel way to treat people with mental illness. We have much better ways. We're still working on it, but we have much better ways today to help people with mental illness. But back then, you just throw them in an insane asylum, kind of lock them away, because they didn't know any better. They didn't know how to treat people with mental illness. And so Dorothea Dix was fighting, one of the first people in America to fight for better treatment for those people. Janessa.
I have a quick question. Can we just list them all, or do we just like pick our most the ones that we think are the most significant? Question number 1 on the study guide.
For question number 1 on the study guide, oh my. Is this still number 1? Are we on number 1 right now still?
I was just asking if we were just supposed to just list them all, or just list a few.
Well, these are the ones that I think are the most important, and these are the ones that I'm gonna hold you responsible for. So I would list these 5.
Okay.
Yeah, I think these are the most important. Okay, and speaking of question number 1, that's the end of number 1. So now we'll move on to number 2. What was the motivating force behind these movements? Why were some Americans so moved to make their country and their world a better place during this time? And the answer is simply Protestant Christianity. There's my picture right there. I was wondering what happened to it. So the Second Great Awakening, right? So this was a movement in our country. I think that may also be a vocab term. A movement in our country that where they wanted to, these Protestants, these Christians, wanted to improve themselves, wanted to improve the world around them. the quote is, "We need to ready our people for the second coming of Jesus Christ," right? So they're like, you know what? It's kind of like when guests are coming over to your house, like, we got to get ready. We got to clean this place up. So they are thinking, you know what? It's possible that Jesus could come at any time. And so we got to get this country ready. We got to get people ready. We have to improve people's lives. So that's the driving force behind the Second Great Awakening. Okay, and that's a simple answer to question number 2. Move on now to question number 3. What happened at the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848? Who was there, and what specifically did they want? Mr. Hahn, talk to us.
All right. So the Seneca Falls Convention was the first women's rights convention in the United States. The participants of the convention included many abolitionists, many religious leaders, and many women's rights activists. We have people like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who actually helped organize the Seneca Falls Convention. There was Lucretia Mott. She was well known for her speeches, and so they invited her to speak at the convention. And then we had abolitionist Frederick Douglass here. Remember, he was a man who escaped slavery and came to the North, and he related his experience of slavery to people through his many powerful speeches. The participants of the Seneca Falls Convention, they wanted women to have the same civil, social, political, and religious rights as men had in the United States. Remember, at this time that women were not seen as equal as men. They did not have the right to vote. They cannot own property. They had to go through so many more loopholes in order to do that than men, in comparison to men. And so they were really fighting to get on that same equal footing as men were on in the United States at the time. So at the convention, they signed the Declaration of Sentiments. This is a document modeled on the Declaration of Independence. Declaration of Independence saying that all men are created equal. And well, the Declaration of Sentiments said that all men and women were created equal. So yes, that's what happened at the Seneca Falls Convention. I think we're good on this one, sir, unless any of y'all got questions. So we're moving on to number 4. How did the Seneca Falls Convention succeed? How did they fall short of their goals? Have their goals been achieved today? Well, let's take a look-see here. Next slide, please, sir. The Seneca Falls Convention was seen as the beginning of the fight for the women's right to vote in the United States. Remember, they couldn't vote in any elections, so they were all these women's rights activists, they were really fighting to get the right to vote. The Declaration of Sentiments was very successful in spreading the news of the women's rights movements across the nation in 1848. It was a very public event. It was very publicized. There were a lot of opponents against the convention, but there's that term. What was it? Any publicity is good publicity, and in this case, it worked out really well for them, even though it was kind of negative. The convention did fall short of its goals because it did not achieve equality for women immediately, but that's kind of a given because it was the first women's rights convention. Change wasn't going to happen immediately, especially during that time period. It was going to take a little bit of time, and that's where we get into the last part of the question. Hold on one second. Yeah, have their goals been achieved today? Well, the goals of the Seneca Falls Convention were achieved in 1920 when the 19th Amendment was passed. I cannot speak today. The 19th Amendment prohibited state and federal governments from denying the right to vote on the basis of gender. So the 19th Amendment pretty much gave women the right to vote. Alexa, you have a question. Alexa?
What was the answer to the second part, the one about I can't really scroll up there. It was the one what was the second question? It was after what was the it was the how did it fall?
How did it fall short? Well, they didn't achieve equality for women immediately. That took a lot more time. The Seneca Falls Convention was the first step It was the first women's rights convention. It wasn't gonna. It was a women's equality for women did not happen immediately. It was going to take a lot more time than what was it? Just after one convention. It actually happened in 1920, nearly 70 years later, with the passing of the 19th Amendment. So it didn't achieve equality immediately. But didn't women still need a man's approval for most things, like a bank account? If you're talking about, yeah. Like Mr. Polito says, women still don't have the wage equality. On average, American women still earn less than men. So back in that time, before the in the 19th century, in the 1800s, before the passing of the 19th Amendment, women still needed to get permission from their husbands to do lots of things, which did include getting a bank account. So yes, you're right. That needs to change. And now we're moving on to number 5.
All right, back to me. Hey, looking at the 2 presentations we learned from in class, the North and the South, what were some of the biggest differences between these 2 sections of the United States in the following categories? And then it was pretty much just it's these areas right here, right? So I just really in this one table right here, I summarized the differences between the North and the South. So in the first area, geography, again, reviewing, the North had a rocky soil. They had harsh, cold winters, and they had deep natural harbors. So if for each of these you want to think about, because we're not going to spend time going through, like this is just a quick review here today. So we're not going to go into detail on like, why do you think deep natural harbors were helpful for the North? Well, I'll give you an example, and I will explain that. So deep natural harbors means that they were able to capitalize on those for shipping and trade, right? So the North ended up, those cities like New York and Boston and Philadelphia, those were deep water harbors where you can get big ships in there and load a lot of stuff on there and then ship them to other parts of the United States or other parts of the world. So that is one of the things that is going to lead to the North becoming what it's going to be at the time of the Civil War. This whole thing right here, everything we're talking about is like leading up to the Civil War, right? So what are the factors? How did North and South split apart and get so different from each other that they were ultimately willing to, kill each other in the Civil War? Okay, so while the North had those characteristics, the South had fertile soil and a mild climate. In population, the North had a very diverse population, very ethnically diverse, very religiously diverse. By 1860, 21 million people living in the North. For the South, by 1860, there were 9 million people living in the South, 5 million whites and 4 million slaves. I would refer you to the Southern class pyramid for more details on that. So that's going to be a big difference, right? When it comes to like the army, when you get to the Civil War, the South did not want to put guns in the hands of slaves for very obvious reasons, because if they do that, the first thing a slave would do is just shoot their masters, right? And set themselves free. So that's the difference between the North and the South population-wise. In terms of economy, the North had a diverse industrial economy, lots of different types of industry in the North, a lot of manufacturing, a lot of different opportunities. Although you remember we learned few rights for workers, right? Low wages, poor working conditions. That's going to continue for a while into the 1900s. As for the South, it was a plantation economy, and for the most part, they just kept whatever profits they made, they kept investing that in more land, more slaves, more land, and more slaves. So ultimately, that's going to harm them when they get to the Civil War, because they're not going to have a diverse economy, a diverse manufacturing economy like the North did. Technology. Inventions galore, right? Improved lives, things like the mechanical reaper, which was a machine that was used to reap wheat or corn, like it was used to automatically collect grain, right? Steam engine, telegraph, the sewing machine. Technology in the South, it was really just the cotton gin. That was the biggest piece of technology, and that was even invented by a Northerner, but it explodes the demand for slaves, and it leads to what we call the Second Middle Passage, right? So that was the Second Middle Passage, if you remember. That was when, because the the slave trade after 1808, you could no longer purchase slaves from Africa or from the Caribbean. And so if you wanted to purchase more slaves, you had to get them from the United States. So what they were doing was in the Deep South, they were purchasing slaves from the Upper South, right? So like tobacco plantations in Virginia don't need as many slaves as a cotton plantation in Mississippi. So the price of slaves went higher. And there's this migration, this second Middle Passage, where families are being torn apart, husbands and wives being torn apart, and children being taken from their families. The first Middle Passage, of course, was the path from Africa to the Americas. The second Middle Passage is this other horrible, tearing apart of families from the upper north to the lower, like the Deep South, after the invention of the cotton gin. Transportation in the north, roads, railroads, canals, turnpikes, a lot of industry, a lot of infrastructure, a lot of that building. Transportation, they had rivers, but very few man-made transportation systems. They're not investing in infrastructure. They're not investing in that transportation like the north is. And then finally, for culture, in the north, it's driven by that Protestant work ethic, right? Like, if you ever heard the expression, idle hands are the devil's plaything, if you've ever heard that, that comes from that Protestant work ethic. It's the idea that, you know what, if you're not busy, if you're not working on something, then you can get into trouble, you can get into mischief. So there is this value in the north that you should be busy, you should be working. You are helping your family and helping your country by staying busy. Diverse forms of Christianity in the north as well. In the south, mostly Anglican and Baptist. There are hundreds of different Christian denominations in our country today. That's just different forms of Christianity. But mostly in the South, Anglican and Baptist Christians. And of course, a very rigid class structure like that pyramid that we talked about. I'm not trying to do an Illuminati symbol. I'm simply trying to show you the pyramid, the Southern class pyramid. Okay, those are the main differences between the North and the South. Any questions on that? And Alexa, I see you showing me the slow down symbol. And the good news, Alexa, is this is all going to be on YouTube. So if I'm talking a little fast, it's only because I want to make sure that we get through everything before noon. But you can always rewatch this again on YouTube after it's uploaded. Okay. Mr. Hunt, hey, what were some of the horrible ways in which slaves were treated in the American South in the time period before the Civil War?
All right, here we go. So slaves, they were forced to work very long hours in the fields of the plantations. They often started before the sun came up, and they worked all throughout the day under the scorching sun, no shade, and they kept working until after it went down as well. These southern states, they passed these laws called slave codes, and these slave codes were laws that were designed to keep slaves from running away or rebelling. These were laws like, they can't organize, they couldn't gather in groups of more than two. They needed a pass from their master to go from place to place, laws like that. And slaves in the antebellum South, they were often whipped or beaten to force them to work on these plantations in order to get the most work out of them. These plantation owners, they would whip these slaves, and it would be even worse if they were caught trying to run away as well, as you can see on the bottom right picture there. And then lastly, and keep in mind, these are just a few examples. There were a lot more, and some of them were a lot worse than what I'm telling you right now. And lastly, the last example that I'm showing you is that slaves were sold at auctions or to other plantations, like we just talked about the second Middle Passage. And these sales often resulted in many families being permanently separated. If you remember the primary sources that we read about how African Americans adapted and fought against slavery, there was that one primary source we read about how that mother, the mother whose child was sold to a different plantation, and she was just wailing and crying. That's because, these families being separated, they would never see each other again. That's why. So you can probably imagine, you probably can't imagine the pain that mother went through to be separated from her child. So the next question, please, sir, unless anybody's got any questions on that one. Doesn't look like it. Number 7, explain some of the clever, creative, and courageous ways in which slaves adjusted to, adapted to, and fought back against their bondage, fought back against slavery. These are going to be from the primary sources that I just talked about. So slaves, they ran away from their plantations in the South to the northern free states, or all the way to Canada. Canada, if you remember, was still British territory, and the Brits, they had already, by this time, they had already banned slavery. Slavery was already illegal in the British Empire, so Canada was the only place in North America that was truly free. Slaves, they also learned how to read and write secretly because it was illegal for slaves to gain any form of education. Remember what Mr. Ippolito just said earlier. Education wouldn't education falling into the wrong. They didn't want Southerners didn't want education to be falling into the wrong hands, and slaves learning how to read and write would definitely be the wrong hands in terms of the South. So that was a big no-no for them. Slaves, they also used religion and the Bible to keep up their morale. That means the morale means like their spirits. You know, they turned to the Christianity and the Bible to keep their spirits up while they were still enslaved. And then they also sang these songs called spirituals. And these spirituals were they described the hardships of slavery, and also they sang they described the salvation, the eventual salvation that would come for them in the future. And then lastly, of course, slaves also found many ways to sabotage the plantation system that was dependent on slavery. So you remember that, you know, the South, they were primarily the economy of the South was primarily dependent on the plantation agriculture, and those plantations themselves were dependent on slavery. So many slaves figured that, hey, if we start sabotaging this plantations, then, you know, we're sabotaging the South's economy. So many of them decided, you know what, this is the route that we're going to take. So my personal favorite one was my personal favorite method of sabotage that I read about in the primary sources was that there was one slave, he claimed to have been blind, and so therefore he didn't have to work in the fields. But then after the Civil War had ended and he was freed, all of a sudden he can magically see, and he turned out to be the best farmer in the region. So that was a pretty clever way to sabotage the plantation system there. I think Mr. Ippolito, he had his favorite method of sabotage that he told us at class session was the slaves that told the masters that these pigs have mallitis. You know, they have this disease called mallitis. You can't eat them, and so, well, so the plantation owners, they gave the pigs to the slaves, and they had a good old time barbecuing up the pigs. And it turns out mallitis was a made-up disease. Who would have thunk it? Not the slave, and not the plantation owners. That's for sure. Fun times.
I love that story.
Oh, me too, sir. All right. Any questions on how African Americans adapted and resisted slavery? There's a lot more and greater examples from the primary sources that we looked at a couple weeks ago as well. Doesn't look like it, sir. Let's move on to the next one.
All right. Who were the main abolitionists we learned about, and in what ways did they fight against the institution of slavery? So these are the abolitionists that we learned about in our class. You see the talkers right here, the Grimke sisters and Frederick Douglass. We've got the writers right here. We've got Harriet Beecher Stowe. She wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. William Lloyd Garrison, he published that newspaper called The Liberator. And then finally the doers, right? The ones who took action, Harriet Tubman and John Brown. So all of them have the different strategies, either, you know, giving speeches or writing printed materials or taking action. Harriet Tubman, of course, was the conductor on the Underground Railroad. Again, just as a reminder, the Underground Railroad was neither underground nor was it a railroad. It is a metaphor for a network of safe houses that led from the edges of the North, like the southern edges of the North, leading all the way up ultimately to Canada. Because with the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850, the only place where you were truly, truly safe was if you could get to Canada, because slavery had already been outlawed in Canada by that time. Alexa, you have a question. Alexa, you're on mute, but you had your hand up.
Oh yeah. For the study guide, I don't know if this is already asked in the chat, but do we need to know Or do you need to write all of them?
Well, you should know the 6 that we learned about, right? So those are the 6. And again, this is everything that we're going over right now. It's all review from what we've learned previously in the class. So the talkers were the Grimke sisters and Frederick Douglass, and the writers were Harriet Beecher Stowe, William Lloyd Garrison, and the doers, the ones who took action, Harriet Tubman and John Brown. But
Okay.
yeah, you should know those. You should know those 6. And then finally, just making one more comment on the doers. If you remember John Brown was the one who led. Well, he did the Pottawatomie Creek massacre in Kansas in 1856-7, where he murdered 5 pro-slavery men, and so that was one of the things that he did. And then the biggest thing that he tried to do unsuccessfully was lead a slave revolt. His raid on Harper's Ferry, where he was going to steal a lot of weapons and then hand them out to all the slaves, and there was going to be this massive slave uprising all across the South, which didn't work. He was captured. He was tried for treason. He was executed. But that was, if you remember John Brown's, while his raid was unsuccessful, it forced the South to think, oh my gosh, there are white people now who are going to be inciting riots, inciting slave revolts, and I'm going to get murdered while my family and I were going to be murdered in our bed. And so that was that pushed us even closer to the Civil War, because the Southerners were arming themselves. They were getting ready. They were like, oh my gosh, we got to be ready for battle if there's a slave uprising, a slave revolt, in our own backyard. Okay. So those are the abolitionists. And then the next question, number 9, in your opinion, which methods of abolitionism do you think were most successful and why? And honestly, that's up to you to decide, right? You did the abolitionist scrapbook page. So you evaluated who you thought was the most effective, the talkers, the writers, or the doers. So you have already answered this question in your own way. So, okay, so there you go. And I will move on to the next question. Number 10, know the most important battles of the Civil War and why each battle was important. Mr. Hahn, why don't you talk to us about that?
All right, so we're gonna. This is from the presentation from last week when we went over the battles of the Civil War. Just going to be going over the shortened summaries over each battle. So we're going to start off with Fort Sumner. Fort Sumner took place near Charleston, South Carolina. Charleston was one of the few ports, the deep water ports that the South had that could receive shipping. Remember that the South didn't have as many of these deep water ports that the North had in comparison. So it was very important for the South to take control of Charleston Harbor. But remember that the Union had control of Fort Sumner at the mouth of Charleston Harbor, and well, they couldn't receive Charleston wouldn't be able to receive any ships or send out any ships with the Union in control of the fort. So the Confederates, they laid siege to Fort Sumner for 36 hours. They fired cannons at the fort. They just started blasting at it. And then at the end of the siege, Union forces ended up surrendering the fort to the Confederates. The significance of the Battle of Fort Sumner was that it was the opening event of the Civil War. It wasn't really quite a battle. It was more, like I said, it wasn't really more of like an open battle where two armies are going at each other, but it was more of a siege where the Confederates were shooting cannons at the Union-controlled Fort Sumner for 36 hours until they surrendered, in which they did. So, opening event of the Civil War. Next slide, please, sir. We got the Battle of Bull Run. The Battle of Bull Run took place 25 miles southwest of Washington, D.C., in near the town of Manassas, Virginia. The battle was characterized with both sides having inexperienced troops. They weren't very well trained. They didn't have that much experience. But the South, they had better leaders. They had military leaders that had that experience, that they had participated in the last American war with Mexico, the Mexican-American War. What was it? The South had generals like Stonewall Jackson, who was very well trained and he was very well disciplined. And when the Union troops were charging his front line, he did not retreat. He actually held his line. That's how he got his nickname. So at the end of the battle, the Union troops, they were defeated and they had retreated back to Washington, D.C. Retreated is a polite term. The Union troops actually broke all manner of discipline and just ran away as fast as they could back to Washington, D.C., dropping anything and everything to make themselves run faster. The significance of the Battle of Bull Run was that it was the first major battle of the Civil War. This was the first time that the Union and Confederate troops were actually on a battlefield and taking shots at each other. And what was it? And another significance of this battle was that both sides found out that the war would not be as quick and easy as they thought it would be. Both sides went into this battle thinking, oh, there's going to be a quick victory. We're going to have, the war's going to be over within the year and everything's going to be back to normal. But it turns out that was not the case. It turned out to be a lot longer and a lot more bloody than they thought it would be. Next slide, please, sir. Next, we have the Battle of Antietam. So the Battle of Antietam took place near Antietam Creek in Maryland. General Robert E. Lee of the Confederacy had invaded the North, and he made it as far as Antietam Creek in Maryland. And his objective was to threaten Washington, D.C. He figured that if he took Washington, D.C., the Union capital, then it would knock the North out of the war. Union troops during the battle actually outnumbered the Confederates 87,000 to 38,000, so they had more than twice the number advantage. And it turned out to be in their favor because the Union won the battle, but this battle came at a great cost. 22,717 Americans on both sides were killed. At this point, this was the bloodiest battle of American military history at the time. The significance of the Battle of Antietam was that the victory here gave President Lincoln the opportunity to announce the Emancipation Proclamation. If you remember that President Lincoln, he wanted to announce the Emancipation Proclamation earlier, but then his advisors told him to wait until they had a victory because the war really wasn't going that well for the Union at the time. And if they announced it while they were still losing, it would have looked at the Emancipation Proclamation would have been looked at as an act of desperation, you know. And then also another significance of the Battle of Antietam was that it drove General Lee back into the South. General Lee took too many casualties during this battle, and if you take too many in the military, if you take too many casualties, if a unit takes too many casualties, they have to move off the line. They have to restock, they reconstitute their numbers. They have to build their forces back up so that they can be an effective fighting unit again. If you go into a battle with less than the required amount of men, then it's just not going to be effective. It's not going to be productive at all. So General Lee had to retreat back to the South after the Battle of Antietam. I think we're good here on the Battle of Antietam, sir. Let's move on to the next one. Cool. Let's see. Next, we have the Battle of Gettysburg. So the Battle of Gettysburg took place in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. General Robert E. Lee, he had done it again. He came and invaded the North again. This time he made it all the way to Pennsylvania, made it past Maryland. Battle of Gettysburg, at Gettysburg, 200,000 men on both sides participated in this battle. Gettysburg was actually the largest battle of the Civil War. You can see on these two pictures here and all the other ones that depict the Battle of Gettysburg, you will see just nothing but troops all across the horizon. There was just that many men there fighting. The battle took place on July 1st of 1863, I want to say. I hope I'm right on that one. So it took place.
You are correct, 1863.
Okay, fantastic, sir. Thank you. So it started on July 1st of 1863, and it continued for 3 days until July 3rd. The Union ended up being victorious again, but again, it was this victory came at great cost. There were 51,000 casualties on both sides of the conflict. That means 51,000 men were either killed, wounded, or missing in action, and that's yikes. That's pretty bad, to be quite honest. The Battle of Gettysburg is the deadliest battle of U.S. military history to this day. To put it in terms of modern day, 51,000 people killed, or 51,000 casualties that we're talking about here would be about 25% of the population of Santa Clarita. I think Santa Clarita has a population of around 200,000. Well, 1 out of 4 people would have been affected by the Battle of Gettysburg, if we want to put it into modern terms. The significance of the Battle of Gettysburg was that it was a turning point in the war. because General Lee would never again have the ability to invade the North again. After the Battle of Gettysburg, he retreated again back to the South, but he could not constitute his numbers, reconstitute his armies, recruit more men, or get the supplies necessary to go back to the North, threaten Washington, D.C. again. Yeah, John, what's your question?
I've got to go.
Okay, that's fine. Remember to watch the video so you can pick up the rest of the information that you're going to miss.
Okay.
Yep, take it easy, John. Any other questions? I don't think so, sir. Let's move on to the next one. Next battle is going to be the Siege of Vicksburg. The Siege of Vicksburg lasted more than 40 days. The Siege of Vicksburg was part of the Union plan to cut the Confederacy in two by controlling the Mississippi River. In order to control the Mississippi River, the Union forces ended up taking a lot of these cities that were on the river, and Vicksburg was the very last one. But then it was Vicksburg was a really tough nut to crack. The Confederates were really dug in, and it would take a lot of force to to dig them out of there. So the Union under General Grant, they decided, you know what, we're just going to lay siege to Vicksburg. So for 40 days, the Union Navy went up and down the Mississippi River, just blasting the city of Vicksburg with cannon fire. You can see that on the bottom left right there. And it was just, oh geez, I can't even imagine being shot at by artillery for 40 days. At the end of it all, at the end of the 40 days, Confederate troops ended up surrendering the city of Vicksburg to General Grant on the 4th of July, one day after General Lee was defeated at the Battle of Gettysburg. The significance of the Siege of Vicksburg was that it was a turning point in the war because now the Union had control of the Mississippi River. And I think we're good on this one, sir. This is a political cartoon showing the Anaconda Plan. This was a plan implemented by the Union at the very beginning of the war. They wanted to cut off the South from any outside contact, from any foreign foreign interference. Say, like, if the South received help from a country like Britain or France, it would definitely help them in the long run because it would, one, give them more weapons and supplies for the war front, but it will also give them more political, political, what's the word I'm looking for here? I guess political strength, for lack of a better term, because if they were recognized by a foreign government, then they would be seen as a actual nation rather than a group of armed rebels that Abraham Lincoln thought the Confederacy was. So the original plan was to blockade the southern states with the Union Navy, and then part of that plan was to also split the Confederacy in two by controlling the Mississippi River. And with control of the Mississippi River, the states of Virginia, the Carolinas, Tennessee, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Florida, they would be cut off from the Confederate states in the West, states like Arkansas, Louisiana, and Texas. So they wouldn't be able to help each other out. So they would be effectively split in two. So the primary focus of the plan was to starve out and to crush the South. With the blockade in place, no ship, the Confederates wouldn't be able to ship out any of the cotton that they needed to be able to trade for goods or for money. And none of the ships coming from Europe or Asia would be able to come in with the goods that the South needed for the war effort. Any questions on the Anaconda Plan? Sir, what did I cover? Everything on that one, or is there more?
Admirably, yes.
Thank you, sir.
Oh,
Emily, what you got for us?
Wait, wasn't this the battle with destroying everything?
No. That's total war. That's the March to the Sea. We're gonna get to that in just a little bit. That's not there. We're not there quite yet. So. All right, doesn't look like we got anything, sir. Let's move on to the next one.
In terms of, I'll just to follow up on what Emily was asking. I think that even though the Anaconda Plan was that, it was really a three-part plan. It was blockade, do the naval blockade of the southern ports, and split the Confederacy at the Mississippi River, and ultimately cut off the head at Richmond, Virginia. I would say that part of the plan, or part of the strategy on the part of the North, was to crush the spirit of the South. Really, they wanted the South to just give up and give in. And part of the way you do that is exactly what Emily was talking about, that total war, that scorched earth campaign in 1864 in Sherman, the Atlanta and Sherman's March to the Sea that you're going to talk about.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
All right, so we're going to get right into the Battle of Atlanta and General Sherman's March to the Sea. So the battle for Atlanta began in July in 1864. I remember Atlanta was a major supply and railroad hub in the South. The South did not have the amount of railroads and the infrastructure that the North had in comparison. The North had a lot more. And so by taking Atlanta, it would have been a major blow to the South supply train. They wouldn't be able to move any of their troops, their equipment, or their supplies as freely as they were able to, as the North was able to, So Union forces under General William Tecumseh Sherman, they ended up capturing Atlanta in September of 1864. The battle was about a month and a half, like a month and some change. And so in September of 64, General Sherman captured Atlanta, and then he continued east towards Savannah, Georgia, in his infamous March to the Sea. During this march, Union forces, they ended up targeting and destroying both military and civilian targets under a policy of total war. Total war means that, you're going after you're attacking civilian infrastructure that would support the war effort. So many of these southern plantations, these southern railroads and these southern the telegraph lines, and they were all targeted and destroyed because these plantations, these railroads, and these telegraph lines, these all supported the South's war effort. And then they also freed a lot of slaves as well, because remember, a lot of these plantations, they were dependent on slaves. Those plantation owners, they weren't going to pick the cotton or harvest the crops themselves. They were going to have the slaves do it. So by freeing these slaves, they took away their labor. The Union took away the South's labor force through total war. The significance of these events was that the South never really recovered from the March to the Sea during the war, and it actually helped lead the South to their surrender. It helped speed up the war, the course of the war, by limiting their ability to fight. So, the March to the Sea, ladies and gentlemen. Any questions on that? Doesn't look like it, sir. Let's move on to the next one. We have the Battle of Richmond and the surrender at Appomattox. So Richmond, Virginia, was the capital of the Confederacy. General Grant, he really wanted to take Richmond because if you cut off the head of the snake, the body will wither and die. But the city of Petersburg was in between him and Richmond. So General Grant laid siege to Petersburg for 9 months. 9 months siege at Petersburg. Ooh. The siege ended when General Lee abandoned Petersburg and Richmond to retreat west. It just wasn't possible for General Lee to hold his position at Petersburg anymore, and Richmond wasn't all that defendable anyways. So he retreated west, and General Grant chased after him and ended up catching up with General Lee at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9th. And then after a short battle, General Lee saw that he wasn't going to be able to win this fight against General Grant, so he ended up surrendering to him. You see on the bottom right there. The significance of the Battle of Richmond and the surrender at Appomattox, these events signaled the end of the Civil War. Fighting still continued sporadically throughout the rest of the year, but with Robert E. Lee surrendering, the rest of the Confederacy, well, they decided to surrender too, because he was the backbone of the Confederate Army at the time. So, and if you take out the backbone, well, then the body's not going to be able to do much anyways. So. That was the Battle of Richmond and the surrender at Appomattox. Any questions? Doesn't look like it, sir. Let's move on.
All right, I'm going to jump in really quickly here because I have been to Appomattox.
Oh.
And so I was, this was very exciting for me when my family and I, we visited 2 summers ago. We visited Virginia, Maryland, Washington, D.C., and so this is the plaque that's right out in front of the building where the surrender took place. And I think the wording is interesting. Have I shared this already, Mr. Hahn?
I don't think so. We might have seen it, but then it was like 20 seconds worth.
Anyway, it's worth sharing again. So Appomattox, here on Sunday, April 9th, 1865, after 4 years of heroic struggle in defense of principles believed fundamental to the existence of our government, Lee surrendered 9,000 men, the remnant of an army still unconquered in spirit. So I find it interesting because this speaks to point of view, right? It all depends on your point of view. You know, we're teaching the Civil War from the vantage point of the Union. The Union had, you know, the Confederacy broke away. They were in rebellion. They wanted to create their own nation that was based on slavery. And in the words of Vice President of the Confederacy, Alexander Stephens, based on the simple truth that the white man is superior to the Negro, is what he said. That is the simple truth, the foundation of the Confederacy, the Confederate States of America. And so we always kind of teach it from a, you know, Confederacy bad, Union good point of view. But it's interesting that you see here, they're talking about, you know, defending the principles believed fundamental to the existence of our government, which kind of begs the question, well, what government? Like, we live under the government of the United States. So what government, when you say our government, are you saying the government of the Confederacy? Are you saying the government of the state of Virginia? So that's kind of interesting there. And then an army still unconquered in spirit. So in other words, it's kind of like there are still some people who are fighting for the Confederacy. And so this is the struggle that we still have in our country today, is if you're still fighting for the Confederacy, so what exactly are you fighting for? Are you fighting for states' rights? Well, that's, you know, that's something that's a discussion that we can have. Are you fighting for, you know, to continue to have whites be superior to other races? Like, is that really a cause that's worth fighting for? So it's interesting. I would guess that this plaque was probably created in the late 1800s or early 1900s. I would guess it was probably created at the time when the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, had a lot of power, had a lot of influence in the South, was trying to keep racial domination of the white race in the South. There's still, like, we have not overcome all of our racial issues. Certainly, if you look at what's going on in Minnesota right now, and the rioting and the you know, everything that's going on. I'm not going to get into all of the news. You can look that up. But there's you know, it's still happening today. Emily says, when was the KKK even formed? It was formed after the Civil War as a means. The KKK is America's original terrorist organization. It was formed as a way to intimidate African Americans into not exercising their newly found rights that they had after the Civil War. So anyway, this is the room where it happened. This is the place where the surrender happened. If you take a look at this right here, there's the room, and I was in that room. We took a picture of that desk, and then this kind of zoomed out here. It's much smaller in real life than it is. That you see the painting? There's that painting that we put here in our slide. I think that's the painting, right? Oh no, it's a different painting. That is a painting of just General Robert E. Lee just signing the surrender, and Grant is over here. It's interesting the way different artists portray these things. Anyway, I could talk for a long time on this, but I want to be respectful of people's time, and so we'll move to question 11. What was the purpose of the Gettysburg Address? Was it considered a success or a failure at the time Lincoln gave this speech? So Gettysburg Address, I'm going to argue Lincoln was making a bold move when he issued it. We talked about this very recently, so I don't want to spend too much time, but basically he uses this phrase, a new birth of freedom. He's talking about the Declaration of Independence. 407 years ago, our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. That's the Declaration of Independence. And so he's saying, you know, we made this nation based on this document 87 years ago. And so now we're in a civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation that is created under those same circumstances and based on those same principles, is this nation going to survive? We're here at a battlefield to commemorate the dead who are fighting in this great war. And I'm not going to go over the whole thing, but here's one quote that I want to focus on. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. So, in other words, he's saying, we're still alive. The people who gave their lives here, the soldiers who died here, they were fighting for a cause. It is for us, the living now, to be dedicated to the work that they started, which is the work of equality, creating a country where truly all people are created equal. And I think that he talks about the unfinished work, and I think, this is my opinion now, I think that work still remains unfinished. I think if you look at, again, what's going on, the rioting that's going on in Minnesota, if you don't know, an African-American man was killed by a police officer, a white police officer, during an arrest. And the nature, it was caught on video, and the nature of the arrest was such that it looks, based on that video, it looks as though that police officer was committing an act of police brutality. And the African-American man died. And I believe I think if my news alerts, Mr. Hahn, I believe if my news alerts are correct, I think that police officer was just arrested this morning and charged, I believe formally charged. And I don't know if it was a murder charge or what that was. Emily says he was kneeling on top of his neck, choking him. That's exactly what was happening. So there are riots going on right now in Minnesota because of an incident that happened with a white police officer and an African-American suspect.
Oh, I just read that he's been charged with third-degree murder.
Third-degree murder. Okay.
Yes, and additional charges are on the way as well. So.
Okay. So when Abraham Lincoln, back 150 years ago, talks about the unfinished work of equality, of all Americans being treated equal, I would argue that it's still unfinished. And I think there are other people who would argue that as well, that we still don't have racial equality in our country. And so that work continues, the fight continues. And then we just go on and you read this final part. This is the last sentence where he's saying, this is the purpose of this war. We need to give meaning to this war. We need to give meaning to the people who died here. We need to make sure that they haven't died in vain, that they died for a purpose. And so here's the purpose, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom. We're going to swap out your old understanding of the Declaration of Independence. Remember when we said back in 1776 that all men are created equal? But really, we didn't mean all men are created equal, right? Like, we were really talking about white, over 21, land-owning men. Like, those are the people we're going to treat the most equal, and everybody else is sort of secondary. And Lincoln is saying, maybe this war is about expanding that definition of freedom. And that government of the people, by the people, for the people shall not perish from the earth. This government that we created, that was created by the people, it was created for the purpose of serving the people. It is for the people. It is of the people. This experiment can't just die here. This experiment in democracy, this experiment in equality, we can't just let it die here in this war. We have to keep this country going. And so that's in 2 minutes. He states beautifully the purpose of this war, what we need to do to fulfill the Declaration of Independence, the true meaning of the Declaration, and it's beautiful, and I love it. And I can talk for the next 3 hours about the Gettysburg Address. However, I do want to be conscious of our time. Mr. Hahn, I still think we're going to end early, which I'm pretty excited about. So
I hope so too.
The next question, number 12, why is this the most famous, the most celebrated, and the most memorized speech in American history? That's up to you to decide. I know we're not gonna. That's you have to make that choice. You need to decide. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Number 13. What were the main causes of the Civil War? How did we get to the point where Americans were killing other Americans by the hundreds of thousands, Mr. Hahn?
Oh boy. All right. So remember from, I think it was last week, we had the 8 main reasons, the 8 main causes of the Civil War. The first and the main cause, and you'll see that the first cause ties in with all the other causes as well. Was slavery. I mean, let's be brutally honest here, ladies and gentlemen. What was it? The South was, like I said before, South's economy was heavily dependent on that plantation agriculture, and those plantations themselves were dependent on slaves. So the South was they were very well dependent on slavery, and they were not going to give up this moneymaker. Just because some Northerners thought that what they did was wrong. So slavery was the major cause of this Civil War. Next, we're going to talk about states' rights versus federal authority. This whole issue, the states' rights and federal authority, has been an issue since the end of the American Revolution. Remember that the 13 colonies, they formed the first U.S. government under the Articles of Confederation. And those articles say, the articles said that the states will be independent of the federal government. They would make their own decisions and laws, but the federal government would take care of national issues such as, alliances, treaties, the military war, and stuff like that. Some of these states, the problem with the Articles of Confederation was that some of these states, they really acted in their own best interest than in the interest of the nation. So it led to a really weak federal government. And so in 1787, representatives from 12 of the 13 states, they came together to Philadelphia to rewrite the Articles, and they eventually wrote up the Constitution of the United States that we follow today. But even then, there was still that issue between states' rights and federal authority. Many of the southern states, they still wanted to keep their independence, and they wanted more states' rights. But the northern states, they wanted less states' rights, and they wanted a stronger federal government. So this states' rights, federal authority issue, it's a beef going all the way back to the end of the American Revolution. Next, we're going to talk about the economic and the cultural differences. You remember that the North, they had the abolitionists. We're going to talk a little bit more on them in a little bit. They had the industrialization. They had the economy based on factories, and then in the South, they were more based on plantations and slavery, and this just led to a different mindset on both from the North and the South, where both sides saw themselves as the better as the better half of the United States, and it just led to this mindset where where each side thought that the other was just inferior and they were out to get them, and eventually ended up culminating in the Civil War. Abolitionists, remember, these are the people that wanted to get rid of the Civil War. Get rid of slavery in the United States of America.
Can I interrupt you briefly? Sorry, Emily had a question.
Go ahead, Emily.
Raising her hand for a little bit.
Wait, do we have to name all of these like on the study guide, or should we just name the most important? Or are they all important?
They're all pretty important, I'd say.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we're talking about causes of the Civil War. So this is and again, Emily, you don't necessarily need to go into detail on the study guide. You don't need to go into detail on each of these, but you should understand that these are what we're considering the 8 main causes of the Civil War.
Mm-hmm. All right, so back to the abolitionists. So these are the people that wanted to ban slavery in the United States, and they were mostly Northerners. There were some Southerners, like the Grimke sisters, who had that just really despised slavery, and they wanted to ban it because of its horrible practices and just on principle in general. We had people like Frederick Douglass, who escaped slavery and shared his experiences through very powerful speeches. And Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote the anti-slavery novel Uncle Tom's Cabin in 1851, that became #2 bestseller in the United States. And then we had people like Harriet Tubman, who helped escape slaves to freedom to the North via the Underground Railroad. And the North, and like I said, they were mostly in the North. A lot of these people in the South, they really hated these abolitionists because, who are they to come around and talk? Who are they to go out in public and talk about and badmouth us and badmouth the South and slavery, because they've never been to these plantations. They'd seen their shares of horror. You can't really deny that Frederick Douglass was not a slave because just because he spoke well, or Harriet Beecher Stowe, even though she based it off of she based her story Uncle Tom's Cabin off of the experiences of a slave. So the South really had no ground to stand on against these abolitionists, but they still hated on them anyways because what are you going to do? And then we're going to move on to the question of the territories. The question in specific was the question of popular sovereignty. Would these new states coming into the Union, would they be free states or would they be slave states? What was it? So in 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act made it so that a new state that would join the Union would vote on whether they would be a free state or a slave state. That's what popular sovereignty is. The voters would determine if the new state would be free or a slave state. This was kind of a problem because both Kansas and Nebraska were above the 36-30 line set by the Missouri Compromise in 1820. Any state north of the 36-30 line would be a free state and slavery would be illegal. So the Kansas-Nebraska Act really overturned the Missouri Compromise. And as a result, many anti and pro-slavery groups rushed to Kansas to vote on whether Kansas would be a free or a slave state. John Brown was actually led one of these groups. He led an anti-slavery group to Kansas, and what was it? It just led to these groups coming into Kansas. It just led to violent fighting between one another. It was actually called Bleeding Kansas at the time. John Brown himself actually took part in a massacre. I can never pronounce that word, sir. What is it, please?
Ottawatomie.
Ottawa, yeah, that's the one. I can't even do it after you just said it. That's how terrible I am. Thank you, sir. And a lot of violent fighting in Kansas. People were killing each other over the issue of making Kansas a free state or a slave state, and the idea of popular sovereignty, where the people vote on where an incoming state would be free or a free state or a slave state, pushed the nation actually closer to war. To the Civil War. Next, we have the Dred Scott case, which was a Supreme Court case where Dred Scott, who was a slave, he sued for his freedom because he had lived as a slave in many free states. His owner moved up into the north and took Dred Scott with him, and then after living in these free states for a long time, they moved back to the South, back to a slave state. But then Dred Scott, he sued for his freedom because he thought that because he lived in one of these free states, he was therefore, where slavery was illegal, he was therefore a free man. In 1857, the Supreme Court ruled that since Dred Scott was a slave, he was considered property and that he had no rights. Therefore, he could not sue for his freedom, nor could he be free just by traveling to a free state. It was the northern abolitionists did not like this Supreme Court ruling at all. It was a step backwards, to say the least. Southerners, however, they loved the Supreme Court ruling because the highest court in our country, the Supreme Court, ruled that slaves were not people, and affirmed their beliefs that that white people were superior to African American slaves. So not like I said, a very big step backwards, the Dred Scott case. Next we have John Brown's raid. We talked a little bit about it earlier. This was a raid in 1857 by abolitionist John Brown at the Federal Armory in Harpers Ferry, Virginia. Brown wanted to give these weapons out. He wanted to hand out these weapons to slaves so that he can incite the slave rebellion. The raid failed. John Brown was captured. He was tried and he was executed for treason against the state of Virginia. The North, they viewed him as a martyr, a man who would sacrifice himself for the cause, in which he did. And the South, they saw him as a terrorist. This is the first time that a white man had come from the North, a white abolitionist had come from the North to incite a slave rebellion in the South. So this drove an even bigger wedge between the North and the South, because now the South thought that these Northerners were going to start coming by more often to try to incite a slave rebellion. So they started militarizing and they started arming their militias in the South in preparation for what they thought was to come. And And then lastly, of course, we got the election of Abraham Lincoln. So if you remember Lincoln, we just talked about this week. Abraham Lincoln was a Republican candidate in the election of 1860. He was opposed to slavery expanding in the new states, but he was fine with the slave states holding on to their slaves. However, many Southerners they didn't know that due to ignorance or due to just misinformation. I'm not too sure, but many Southerners actually believed that he was against slavery in the South, and if elected, he was going to take away their slaves. So because of this, Lincoln was not on the ballot in 10 of the southern states, but he ended up winning the election anyway because he got 40% of the popular vote and the majority of the electoral votes, mainly from the northern states, because remember, the electoral votes are tied to the population of the state, and the North definitely had more people living there than they did in the South. Remember from that election map, the states of New York and Pennsylvania, their electoral votes actually outnumbered all of the electoral votes in the South. So, yeah. The southern states, they didn't like that, Abraham Lincoln got elected, so they seceded from the Union a month later after the election, and they started off with South Carolina seceding on December the 20th in 1860. And then by February 4th of 1861, the Confederate States of America were formed in the South. Nathan had a question. What was a fugitive slave law again? Is that the one where you can see a free slave, you can expect that it was a slave who had escaped? Yes, that's part of it, Nathan. The fugitive slave law of 1850 effectively turned every northerner into a policeman, quote, quote, and stated that, everybody was responsible for returning escaped slaves in the North back to their owners in the South because slaves were property. A lot of Northerners didn't like that. A lot of Northerners didn't follow it. But then the second half of the fugitive slave law allowed Southerners to go into the North to recapture runaway slaves. And like you said, Nathan, a lot of these people, they just assumed that any African American would do. So there was a real risk living as an African American in the North, because here comes a Southerner saying, "Hey, you're the slave that escaped from the plantation over here in Georgia," and then you would have no say in it at all. They would recapture you, throw you back into slavery on a plantation in the South. It was no good. So yeah, Emily, it was the North had to capture any escaped slaves plus bring them back to the South. So yep, there we go. Thank you very much, Emily. Any questions on the causes of slavery? If y'all, what was it? There's more detailed information on these eight causes on the slideshow that Mr. Ippolito showed us. I believe it was last week. Yes. Doesn't look like it, sir. Let's move on to the next one.
Okay, and Mr. Hahn, for
Yes, sir.
the sake of time,
Oh, geez, I didn't even realize how late it was.
I'm saying that we're supposed to be done in 5 minutes.
Mm.
So here's what I'd like to do, because we're almost there. We're almost to the end,
Mm-hmm.
but I definitely want to respect everyone, especially since they've been so good about sticking around to the bitter end. So first of all, hey, everyone who is here right now, can you just type something in the chat just so I can see a record? I'm just curious, because sometimes you can turn your video off, right, and then just step away and go and play basketball or whatever. But if you could just put a little thing in the chat, just like hello or what's up or whatever, I just want to see that you're still listening, that you're still with us. I would appreciate that. I see you guys are awesome. Thank you. All right, so here's what we're going to do. Mr. Hahn, and I apologize for the squeaking of the dog toy in the background. That is the dog. So Mr. Hahn has this great information to share, which I'm going to prevent him from sharing it, but he prepared this great slide too, just that answers the question, how was our nation a better nation, a different nation and a better nation after the Civil War ended? We talked about this very recently, and if you want, you can go back to the recording and and watch this. But that all speaks to that speaks to that. Nathan, a martyr is someone who dies for a cause, whether it's a religious cause or a political cause. That's what a martyr is. And then, how was Abraham Lincoln uniquely suited to be president of the United States during our nation's greatest challenge? Mr. Hahn, in one of our previous classes, talked about him being committed, compassionate, and charismatic. I also did a little bit of research, and the Abraham Lincoln Center for Character Development at Lincoln College identified these traits: his honesty, empathy, humility, perseverance, courage, intellect, vision, responsibility, and leadership. And aren't these all qualities that we aspire to as well? So there's a reason why he is consistently rated as our nation's greatest president. That final question, why do you think that he's so consistently ranked that? And again, that's up to you to decide, but we gave you some good information there that you can kind of think about, and you can come up with your own conclusions. All right, folks, really quickly, I do want to, there's of course no way, and I knew that there was not going to be any way for us to get to the vocab, but that's part of the reason why I gave you the Quizlet. I do want to encourage you to join us on Sunday. So in 2 days, join us for YouTube Live, where we can go over any questions from the study guide. We can go over the vocab, like we can just talk about whatever it is you want to talk about, because on Monday, we're going to have that exam. And the link to the Quizlet is here. The link to the Quizlet is also in Google Classroom. And now at this point I can't think of anything else. Mr. Hahn, anything else?
Not that I can think of, sir.
Nathan is asking, what was the election of 1860 again? So Nathan, Mr. Hahn just talked about that briefly. The election of Abraham Lincoln. That was kind of the final straw that pushed our nation to civil war, because at that point the South felt so powerless that they had no control over the fact that this abolitionist, they believed, had just gotten elected to the presidency, and he was surely going to fight to dismantle slavery in the United States, which, if we're being honest, he did. So the South's fears were, it was like the self-fulfilling prophecy. They were ultimately realized. And was Harriet Tubman the female slave who escaped and helped free other slaves? Yes, Harriet Tubman was the one who conducted what we call the Underground Railroad, even though it was neither underground nor was it an actual railroad, but that network of safe houses where slaves in the middle of the night could travel from house to house. And now there are gardeners outside and the dog's going crazy. So probably a good time. Alexa, what's your question?
Can I leave right now?
Yes, so this is probably a good time while the dog's going crazy to say thank you so much for joining us. Mr.
Thank
Hahn.
you.
Oh, yes, I'm going to go ahead, Mr. Hahn, and I'll stop our recording.